During the dark winter nights of late 1894, several lone women making their way through the deserted thoroughfares of Kensington in West London were terrorised by a mysterious veiled woman dressed all in black who would waylay them with an innocuous question and, upon receiving a reply, would suddenly launch an unprovoked, vicious and horrible attack upon them. The trepidation that her deeds provoked was akin to the disquiet engendered by the Whitechapel murderer of 6 years previous, and newspapers began equating the woman's actions with those of the earlier fiend, and her atrocities gave rise to similar lurid headlines as those generated by the activities of her predecessor. As the penny illustrated paper put it on Saturday the 8th of December, the West End of London has been experiencing a sensation comparable to the thrill that ran through the East End of town when the still undiscovered Jack the Ripper perpetrated his atrocities in Whitechapel. This is the story of 2 weeks in 1894 when the citizens in the West End of London found themselves exposed to the same horror as their East End counterparts had been in 1888, and of how, in the aftermath of the crimes, the culprit responsible for the savage attacks may well have evaded justice on account of her social standing. The first victim of the miscreant, whom the press came to refer to as the woman in black, was Mrs. Sarah Haynes, who was attacked here at the junction of Queensgate and Stanhope Gardens at around 10:20 on the night of November the 17th. The penny illustrated paper helpfully provided readers with a sketch showing the exact spot where the assault had occurred. This is the same spot today. Mrs. Haynes made a statement about her ordeal, which was published in the Evening Standard on Monday the 3rd of December. I am the wife of Charles Haynes, a coachman working for Mr. Maidment at Stanhope Mews. We live at number 4 Southwell Gardens, Gloucester Road. About 20 minutes past 10 on Saturday night a fortnight ago, I had been out shopping and went home and put my purchases down on the sofa. I again left home and walked as far as Arthur Street in the expectation of meeting my husband there. Not meeting him, as I expected, I turned back and retraced my steps towards home. I went by way of Fowler's Terrace, crossing over Sussex Place into Queensgate. As I was crossing the roadway in Queensgate and stepping up to the pavement, I noticed a woman standing not very far away. I fancy she was dressed in black and wore a hat and jacket. It is impossible for me to say whether her face was veiled or not. I should say she was 5 feet or 5 feet 2 inches at the outside in height. She seemed to me to be altogether a little woman of slender build. My impression was that she was a quiet and respectable person. I had crossed over the roadway just opposite to where she was standing, and after I had taken a few steps, I found she was walking behind me. She caught me up in a moment or two and came to me on my right side, she being on the outside of the pavement. She asked, "Is this Prince's Gate?" It was undoubtedly a woman's voice. I turned a little to one side, intending to say, "No, this is Queensgate." Before I could even catch a glimpse of her face or get further than the word Queen's, her left arm was thrown round my neck, and in a moment I was stabbed with some sharp instrument through the eye. She plunged the weapon into my forehead, just above the right brow, and I am told by the doctors that it passed through the back of the eye. It was a terrible gash. She caught me from behind with her left arm and stabbed me twice in rapid succession. She did not draw out the weapon after the first blow, but partly drew it out slowly and then plunged it in again, at the same time exclaiming, "Take that, you old woman!" She then let go and ran back towards Sussex Place. Sarah had screamed loudly, and within moments a constable had arrived at the scene. According to the Tamworth Herald, he made a hurried search for the woman, who by this time had completely disappeared. He then again turned his attention to the victim, who was bleeding profusely from the wound in her face. Assistance was procured, and she was conveyed to St. George's Hospital, where she was detained as an inpatient. The Evening Standard informed readers that Mrs. Haynes's sister, who is the head sister at the hospital, has said that she had had frequent conversations with Mrs. Haynes since her admission to the hospital, but was utterly unable to arrive at any conclusion as to the motive for the attack or the identity of the assailant. Her sister had lived in the vicinity of Stanhope Gardens for a great number of years and was well known and generally respected by her neighbours. She had never heard of Mrs. Haynes having a quarrel of any kind with a female acquaintance. In consequence of the assault and the serious nature of the injuries inflicted, it has been found necessary by the medical authorities to remove the right eye. On the evening of Saturday the 1st of December, the assailant struck again, her victim this time being a servant girl by the name of Susan Pierce, who worked at one of the houses in Stanhope Gardens. The Weekly Dispatch published details of what happened. The victim of this outrage proved to be Susan Pierce, a housemaid who was at present staying with her family at 36 Godfrey Street, King's Road, Chelsea. When she was assailed, she was on her way to Courtfield Gardens, and while passing through Stanhope Gardens, she noticed that she was being followed by a woman dressed all in black. When opposite 28 Stanhope Gardens, the woman, who had kept close with her, touched her and said in a sharp tone of voice, "Is that Gloucester Road?" The girl had barely time to answer in the affirmative when the woman exclaimed, "Take that, you—" At the same time, Pierce felt a sharp blow on the forehead, as though she had been struck by some cutting instrument. The blow was so sudden and unexpected that the violence of it forced her off the pavement into the road. She managed to stagger across the road, and a lady and gentleman came to her assistance, whereupon the unknown woman walked away in the direction of Queensgate, and she did not again get a glimpse of her. She was a slender little woman wearing a hat and a tight-fitting jacket with a heavy veil drawn over her face. It was so foggy at the time that pursuit with any prospect of success was entirely out of the question. The girl, Miss Pierce, was at the time bleeding freely from the wound in her forehead, and a small knot of people soon gathered around her. Assistance was sent for by some of those present, and upon the arrival of a constable upon the scene, some minutes after the actual occurrence, she was taken to the surgery of Dr. Lenton Heath of 90 Cromwell Road, who first of all dressed the wound and then sent her home to Chelsea. The authorities believe the perpetrator of the outrages, the article concluded, to be a female lunatic with homicidal tendencies. Although the press coverage of the attack on Sarah Haynes had been somewhat muted to the point of being non-existent, the newspapers showed no such restraint after this second attack, and headlines such as "The Mysterious Woman, Kensington Police Baffled," "The Kensington Stabbing Mystery," "The Mysterious Female, She Again Visits Kensington," "Mysterious Outrages in London," and "The Woman in Black, The Stabbing Outrages in Kensington," began to appear in newspapers far and wide. And on Monday the 3rd of December, 2 more attacks occurred within a few hours of each other, this time in Camden Hill Road off Kensington High Street. The Portsmouth Evening News printed the following account of what happened. A further alleged outrage by the woman in black is reported by 2 servant girls, Alice Blaird and Alice Brynd, in the employ of Mr. G. H. Boughton, West House, Camden Hill Road, Kensington. They left the house about 9:30 on Monday night to visit a friend. When opposite the gardens at the junction of the road leading towards the Holland Road, a lonely part, the women saw a dark figure advancing towards them. At first they took little notice, but when they met the woman, she asked them where the road led to. Alice Blaird was about to reply when the woman suddenly raised her left hand, declaring in a gruff voice that she had something in it, and shouted, "Take that!" The women screamed and ran away as fast as they could. At the end of the road they found 2 policemen, who returned with them to the spot indicated. But the mysterious woman was not discovered there. They then proceeded to the police station and laid an information against the stranger. Alice Blaird told a reporter that she was never so frightened in her life as when the strange woman raised her hand. "We saw her coming towards us. She was keeping right under the shadow of the wall and met us midway between 2 lamps. I looked hard at her when she asked the question, and I should know the face again. It was a cruel face. Her eyes I shall never forget. They were big and looked to me like the fixed glass eyes in one of my master's dummy models. They had a fiery look, yet no expression in them. Her face was big and thick-skinned, with a nose quite flat and a large mouth. Her hair was dark, and on her head she wore a sailor hat, and over the front brim lay a black veil, turned evidently back from her face. She was dressed in either a black or dark brown dress and jacket. The jacket was one of the fashionable double-breasted ones, and the large collar was turned up round her throat. Miss Blair went on to say that she believed the figure was that of a man in woman's clothing. The newspaper concluded the article by revealing that the police of the district state that Miss Blair's story is quite correct from her point of view, but that they have found the woman who frightened them and that she was drunk at the time. They will not, however, give her name or address, and it is assumed they are endeavouring to allay the great excitement which undoubtedly prevails in the neighbourhood of Kensington. Shortly after 10 o'clock that night, Miss Annie Kelly, a maid employed at No. 6 Camden Hill Road, left the house to post some letters in the pillar box in Upper Phillimore Gardens. On her return, and when opposite the adjoining house, No. 7, the Portsmouth Evening News reported, she was suddenly accosted by a woman who approached her from the direction of Kensington High Street. The woman asked her, "Have you got any bits?" meaning, Annie presumed, scraps of food. Annie replied, "No," whereupon the woman came nearer to her and remarked, "It's a wonder. I always had some when I was in service." And so saying, she peered right into Annie's face, and the terrified girl could, so she later told our reporter, see her eyes gleaming through the heavy dark veil which she wore over her face. I felt frightened by the woman's threatening manner and made as quickly as I could for our area steps and got indoors. As I reached the steps, and she was still quite close to me at the time, I heard her say, "Here," and then followed some muttering which I could not distinguish, but it struck me as being a threat. I did not see any weapon, though the woman's conduct filled me with alarm. I had not at the time heard of the cases of stabbing which had previously occurred. I mentioned the unusual occurrence to the housekeeper immediately I got home. The woman, I should think, stood 5'1" or 5'2" and was well proportioned. She wore a jacket and was attired in black, while she also carried a muff of a dark colour. She had on a big black hat with feathers, to which was appended a fall which was drawn tightly over her face. Her features were indistinguishable, but when she stuck her face right in mine, I could see a pair of big staring eyes which seemed to be looking straight into me. The voice I heard was a gruff one, but I should think it was that of a woman. If I saw her again in similar costume, I should undoubtedly be able to identify her. Over the course of the first weekend in December, rumour had been rife in the neighbourhood that the attacks were in fact being carried out by a man in women's clothing. And so a journalist from the Westminster Gazette approached a high-ranking police official for clarification on this point. The newspaper published his response on Monday the 3rd of December. It was stated by a police officer in high command this morning that the authorities do not for one moment believe in the theory that has been put forward that in the Queensgate and Stanhope Gardens affairs the deed of violence was performed by a man disguised in women's clothing. The theory entertained is that these violent assaults are the acts of a female lunatic possessed of murderous instincts. There could be no doubt that the attacks had, in the words of one newspaper, thrown the neighbourhood into a state of alarm, and the police and public alike were on the lookout for the mysterious veiled attacker. A local resident wrote to the Morning Post on Thursday the 6th of December to tell how his wife had, apparently, had a narrow escape. To the editor of the Morning Post, "Sir, I beg to inform you that the information given in your columns concerning the dangerous wandering lunatic of Kensington was yesterday forenoon the means of saving my wife from attack. Later in the day, as I learnt this morning from an eyewitness, 2 ladies were accosted by the same small female dressed in black. They turned and ran as the first lady had done. One of them, who was much agitated, my friend spoke to and asked for her name, etc., as he wanted to run in the woman whom he could then have laid his hands on. Would you believe it? She would not give it, and so by her want of public spirit and boldness was indirectly the cause of the opportunity being lost. He was one of 2 men I had spoken to immediately after my wife's adventure, and was keenly on the scent. Unfortunately, he had not clearly noted or had forgotten my name and address, or undoubtedly I, or better, my wife, would in the public interest have been glad to appear. On finding a policeman and pointing out the suspicious female still in sight, the man refused to arrest her as there was no evidence. Now here, it seems to me, there was clearly a chance lost, and to the unworthy shrinking of some individual from publicity is to be ascribed the fact that innocent persons are still exposed to the senseless destructive malice of this miserable wandering demoniac. I am hunting all I know, and am going out now on my bicycle to run all around the byroads in the vicinity. Yours, etc., No Alarmist, December the 5th. The next day, the Echo reported that No Alarmist wasn't the only civilian out on the streets trying to hunt down the assailant. A local bodyguard. A large number of the young men of the neighbourhood are every night to be found ready to act as bodyguard in case of emergency, while several of the more restless spirits are to be met with during the later hours of the night in their expeditions of exploration. Such a band are reported to have given chase to the supposed offender on Wednesday night and to have lost sight of her in the neighbourhood of Stanhope Gardens. A week later, there was a great deal of excitement when news broke that a woman had been arrested on suspicion of being the woman in black, but this turned out to be a false hope. The Portsmouth Evening News gave details in its edition of Saturday the 15th of December. A woman in black arrested and discharged. The police in the neighbourhood of Sloane Square were reported to have made an important arrest yesterday in connection with the Kensington stabbing outrages. In fact, that they had secured the mysterious woman whose movements had given rise to much excitement in the West End of late. Inquiry showed, however, that though an arrest had taken place, its importance had been altogether overestimated. It appears that during the afternoon, a young lady, while waiting at the station for the arrival of her parents, observed a female signalling to her. She was dressed entirely in black and wore a veil of black material. A police officer who was on duty close by at the time also noticed the woman's gestures and, struck by the similarity of her appearance to that given of the individual accused of the Kensington outrages, he went into the station and spoke to her. After betraying great nervousness, she said that she merely wanted to ask the young lady where she could obtain lodgings for the night. The officer, however, felt justified in taking her into custody and escorted her to the lock-up in Gerald Road, where she was detained pending the arrival of one of the assaulted females, who was sent for the purposes of identification. The accused woman was subsequently placed among others of her sex, but failing to be identified, was set at liberty. Although no further attacks were reported throughout the rest of December, and indeed on into 1895, emotions continued to run high, as is evidenced by the following story that appeared in the Bayswater Chronicle in early January 1895. A curious story comes from Kensington Square. A lady who shared the present panic was going through Melbury Road one afternoon when, in a lonely part, a woman, respectably dressed, asked her the way to the very square in which she lived. Thinking this a certain prelude to the usual stab with the knife, the lady, with great presence of mind, hit her interrogator 2 violent blows in the face with the handle of her umbrella, which put her to flight, and ran home at the top of her speed. It was an adventure of which she thought she had reason to be proud, though it rather upset her. She had advertised for a cook, and at 5 o'clock was expecting a person to call upon her for the situation. The person did not arrive, however, till nearly 6, and then not in a very presentable condition. A bandage was on her forehead, and some sticking plaster over her nose. "I am sorry," she said, "ma'am, to be late, but I have had a frightful adventure." I asked my way to your house of a person who almost looked like a lady, and she up with her umbrella and knocked me about most dreadful. However, I am glad to have escaped, for I have no doubt it was the Kensington Ripper." Similar stories appeared in the press throughout January, but no further attacks were reported, and gradually the panic in the district began to subside. The woman in black had, it seemed, ceased her nocturnal activities, but what had actually become of her was anyone's guess. Then, on Monday the 28th of January, the London correspondent of the Freeman's Journal revealed that local gossip was blaming the attacks on a woman from the higher echelons of Victorian society. The London outrages, startling rumour. A titled lady suspected. I understand that the authorities have recently had information pointing plainly to a lady of title as the perpetrator of the recent series of stabbing outrages in Kensington. The information proceeded, I am told, from the household of the lady in question, but the injured women failed to identify her. In fact, the woman who was most seriously attacked has practically expressed her inability to identify her assailant at all. It is admitted, I believe, that the suspect is not quite in her right mind and has been for a considerable time a prey to a maniacal jealousy, which it is supposed she selected this method of gratifying. The lady, in addition to possessing a title through her husband, is also the daughter of a peer of an historic family. She is a comparatively young woman, married only a few years, and was until recently rather well known in society. The next day, the Toronto Daily Mail was of the opinion that the woman's social status had enabled her to evade justice. A woman's freaks. The London police recently received conclusive information that the perpetrator of a sensational series of outrages on women in Kensington last month is a woman of title and the daughter of a peer of an historic family. The influence which in many recent cases has enabled malefactors of rank to escape justice prevailed with the authorities in this case also, and she has been permitted to go to the continent under promise of the careful surveillance of the family. There is said to be hereditary insanity in her family. On Sunday the 10th of February, Lloyd's weekly newspaper published a similar claim. The female population of Kensington were much exercised by several stabbing assaults committed on young servants by a mysterious woman in black. In 2 cases, the injury inflicted was somewhat serious, and much apprehension for a time prevailed, many ladies staying indoors during the fortnight the scare lasted. Now there are said to be reasons for believing that this female stabber of girls is the deranged wife of a member of the House of Lords. At any rate, this startling story is generally current in Kensington society. Nothing more was reported on the case for almost 4 months. Then, on the 29th of April, another victim, a 12-year-old boy, was stabbed in the eye whilst playing in a Kensington thoroughfare, and this time there was an arrest. The Kensington News and West London Times gave details of this latest atrocity and of the court appearance by the perpetrator in its edition of Saturday the 25th of May. Extraordinary charge of stabbing. At the West London Police Court on Wednesday, a woman who was supposed to be the one who committed the mysterious acts of stabbing in South Kensington was brought up on a warrant charged with unlawfully wounding Charles Trollope, aged 12, by stabbing him in the eye with a hatpin. She gave the name of Eliza Dowling and described herself as a needlewoman living in Crescent Street, Notting Hill. She appeared about 40 years of age, poorly dressed and wearing a hat. The boy, who had a shade over the left eye, said he lived with his parents in Dove Mews, Kensington. On the evening of the 29th of April, he was playing at touch with some boys in Dove Mews when the prisoner, who had been with some men outside the Clarence in Glendhowe Terrace, came up and asked him what he had got. He replied, "A home." She was asking all sorts of questions. She asked another boy what he had got, and he replied, "A mother." She then said to the witness, "You have got a home, you darling," and hit him in the eye. The chief clerk asked the boy, "What with? A hat pin?" "I did not see it," replied the boy. "It was something sharp." She then walked on. "Did your eye bleed?" asked the chief clerk. "Yes," was the boy's reply. The magistrate asked him if he could see with it, to which Charles replied, "No, there is a kind of mist over it." At this point the prisoner interrupted, protesting that, "I never saw the boy. He must have taken me for somebody else. I don't use hat pins." And so saying, she showed some elastic which was fastened round her back hair. The boy further stated that he did not see the prisoner again until Tuesday night, when he saw her in the street and gave her in charge. William Wines, another boy, also identified the prisoner. He said she was first quarrelling with 3 men who went away. She took Trollope by the shoulders and stabbed him in the eye with a hat pin. He saw it in her hand. She had been holding the head of the pin in the palm of her hand and the point up her sleeve. At the request of Detective Sergeant Ham, the prisoner was remanded. The prisoner was removed, protesting loudly that she was not the woman and that the boy had made a mistake. Of course, if, as was being widely reported, Eliza Dowling was the woman in black, then that would mean that Lloyd's and the other newspapers had got it wrong earlier in the year when they had assured their readers that the assailant was the wife of a member of the House of Lords. Lloyd's weekly newspaper therefore sent one of its representatives to make special inquiries into the matter. His findings were published on Sunday the 9th of June. From the peculiar manner of the woman, and her answering in some measure to the published description of the Kensington stabber, the police at first thought that they had made an important capture. She was, however, confronted on Friday with 2 of the assailed persons, a servant girl and an elderly woman, who had been stabbed in the eye, and they both very positively pronounced her not to be the woman who had attacked them. That woman, they averred, was shorter and thinner than Dowling, and the police now inclined to the belief that the story which Lloyd's published from authentic sources concerning an insane lady of title who had escaped from surveillance is the true solution of the mystery which surrounds the personality of the Kensington terror known as the Woman in Black. On Friday the 7th of June at the Clerkenwell Sessions, Eliza Dowling had been sentenced to 9 months' hard labour, having been found guilty of the malicious wounding of Charles Trollope, causing actual bodily harm. The sentence evidently did not act as a deterrent, as her name would turn up in newspapers several times over the next few years, when she appeared in various police courts charged with further stabbings, the most serious of these being in November 1897, when she appeared at the Old Bailey, having stabbed Police Constable Vesey in the ear and several other places about the face and head with a pair of nail scissors. For this crime she was given 4 years' penal servitude, and thereafter mentions of her disappear from the public record. Whether or not she was the mysterious woman in black is now almost impossible to ascertain. The modus operandi in the stabbing of Charles Trollope certainly bore some similarities to the earlier attacks, albeit she wasn't wearing a veil, and the victims of the previous assaults were apparently adamant that she didn't resemble the woman who had attacked them. Perhaps the claims made by the Freeman's Journal, Toronto Mail, and Lloyd's weekly newspaper that the perpetrator was a titled lady who had been sent abroad by her family were closer to the truth, and this might, of course, explain the sudden cessation of the attacks. Interestingly, although almost every newspaper in the country made mention of the attacks when they occurred in November and December 1894, only a handful reported the assertion that the woman responsible may have been a titled lady. Make of that what you will, dear viewer. The truth is that, barring some possible remarkable find in a dusty family archive, we will now never know the identity of the mysterious woman who terrorised the residents of Kensington for a brief period in late 1894. If she was a woman of title who was allowed to disappear abroad without being arrested and charged for her crimes, then there undoubtedly was an official cover-up that involved the government, the aristocracy, and the police. And if they did cover up the identity of this particular perpetrator, who's to say how many other malefactors were allowed to escape justice simply because they belonged to the higher echelons of Victorian society and were considered above the law and were therefore allowed to be spirited away by their families? Let me know if you can think of any in the comments below.